On February 24th, 2022, the largest war in Europe since World War II began. In the first year alone, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded. Over 10 million people were forced from their homes, and the entire global order was thrown off balance. But here's what most people don't understand. This war didn't start in 2022. It started decades earlier. And behind the two flags you see fighting on the front lines, there are far bigger powers pulling strings, spending billions, and quietly deciding how this war ends. In the next few minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how this war started, who is really backing Russia, who is really backing Ukraine, and who is profiting while ordinary people pay with their lives. Stay till the end, because the truth about who benefits from this war might surprise you. To understand this war, we have to go back to 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ukraine became an independent country, but it remained deeply tied to Russia through language, culture, economy, and history. For over a decade, Ukraine tried to balance itself between two worlds, the West with the European Union and NATO, and the East with Russia. Meanwhile, NATO, the military alliance built by the United States and Western Europe during the Cold War to counter the Soviet Union, kept expanding eastward. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and eventually the Baltic states joined NATO, moving the alliance's borders closer and closer to Russia. Russia saw this as a direct threat. From Moscow's point of view, NATO was creeping toward its front door, and if Ukraine, Russia's neighbor and historical ally, ever joined NATO, Russian leaders believed it would be a red line they could not accept. The tension exploded in 2014. Ukraine's pro-Russian president was removed from power after massive protests known as the Euromaidan Revolution, when the government suddenly rejected a trade agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. The public backlash forced him to flee the country. Russia responded almost immediately. Russian forces, without official markings, moved into Crimea, a peninsula in southern Ukraine, and annexed it within weeks. At the same time, Russian-backed separatists took control of parts of the eastern Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, known together as the Donbass. A quiet war had already begun, one that would kill over 14,000 people between 2014 and 2022, years before most of the world was paying attention. Fast forward to late 2021. Russia began massing well over 100,000 troops along Ukraine's borders. Western intelligence agencies warned repeatedly that an invasion was coming. Russian officials denied it, calling it a military exercise. Then, on February 21st, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin recognized the independence of the separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. 3 days later, on February 24th, he announced what he called a special military operation, and Russian forces launched a full invasion of Ukraine from the north, east, and south simultaneously. Putin's stated goals were the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, claims that Ukraine and most of the international community rejected as false pretexts. Many Western analysts argue the real goal was to prevent Ukraine from ever joining NATO or the EU, and to pull it back firmly into Russia's sphere of influence. Ukraine, led by President Volodymyr Zelensky, refused to surrender. Against the expectations of many military analysts, Ukrainian forces held the capital, Kiev, and pushed Russian troops back from the north within weeks, turning what many expected to be a quick war into one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the 21st century. Now let's talk about who is standing behind each side, because this war is not just Russia versus Ukraine. It's a proxy battlefield for much bigger global powers. China has not sent weapons directly, but it has become Russia's most important economic lifeline. As Western nations cut off trade and froze Russian assets, China dramatically increased its purchases of Russian oil and gas and expanded trade in electronics, machinery, and vehicles, helping keep the Russian economy afloat. China has also been accused by Western governments of supplying dual-use components, technology that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. Iran has supplied Russia with thousands of Shahid attack drones, which Russia has used extensively to strike Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure. In return, reports suggest Russia has shared military technology with Iran, deepening military cooperation between the two countries. North Korea has supplied Russia with large quantities of artillery shells and ballistic missiles, and, according to Ukrainian and South Korean intelligence, has even sent thousands of its own troops to fight alongside Russian forces. In exchange, North Korea is believed to be receiving food, fuel, and advanced military technology, including help with satellites and missile systems. Belarus, under President Alexander Lukashenko, allowed Russia to use its territory as a launching pad for the initial invasion and continues to host Russian troops and weapons, including reports of Russian nuclear-capable missiles stationed on Belarusian soil. So while Russia faces heavy Western sanctions, it isn't isolated. It has built a network of partners who help sustain its war economy and its war machine. On the other side, Ukraine has received support from a broad coalition of Western nations, led primarily by the United States and the European Union. The United States have provided tens of billions of dollars in military aid, including artillery, ammunition, air defense systems like the Patriot, HIMARS rocket launchers, and eventually tanks and F-16 fighter jets. The U.S. has also provided intelligence sharing that has helped Ukraine target Russian forces. European countries, Germany, the U.K., Poland, France, and others, have combined to match or exceed U.S. military assistance, while also providing massive humanitarian aid and taking in millions of Ukrainian refugees. The UK in particular was one of the first nations to send heavy weapons and has remained one of Ukraine's most vocal supporters. Poland and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have been especially aggressive backers, partly because they view Russia as a direct existential threat to their own security, given their shared Soviet history and geographic proximity. Importantly, NATO as an alliance has not sent troops to fight directly in Ukraine. Doing so risks direct war between NATO and Russia, two nuclear powers. Instead, member countries individually supply weapons, training, and funding, while avoiding actions that could trigger a wider war. Behind all these political and military calculations are real human lives. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides have been killed or wounded. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have died. Over 10 million Ukrainians have been displaced, either as refugees abroad or displaced within their own country. The war has also triggered a global food and energy crisis. Ukraine and Russia together used to supply nearly a third of the world's wheat exports. When shipments stopped, food prices spiked around the world, hitting some of the poorest countries in Africa and the Middle East hardest, far from the battlefield itself. Europe also faced an energy crisis as it scrambled to cut its dependence on Russian gas, sending energy prices soaring and squeezing ordinary households across the continent. So with all this destruction, who actually benefits? Defense contractors in the U.S. and Europe have seen massive profits as governments race to restock weapons and expand military production. Countries like Poland have used the war to justify becoming one of the largest military spenders in Europe, rapidly modernizing their armed forces. Energy exporters outside the conflict, including the United States, Qatar, and Gulf nations, have profited by filling the gap left by Russian gas in the European market. Countries like China and India have benefited by buying discounted Russian oil that Western nations refuse to purchase, strengthening their own economies while Russia struggles to find buyers elsewhere. And geopolitically, the war has pushed traditionally neutral countries like Finland and Sweden to abandon decades of neutrality and join NATO, something Russia's invasion was, ironically, supposed to prevent in the first place. At its core, this war is about more than just two countries fighting over land. It's about the balance of power between Russia and the West, the future of NATO, and who controls the resources, energy, grain, and influence that shape the entire world. But no matter which side you support, one truth doesn't change. It's ordinary soldiers and civilians who are paying the real price for decisions made in Moscow, Washington, Brussels, and Kiev. If you want to understand more wars like this one,